Very good morning to all of you here today. This is
Good morning,
our
ma'am.
good morning. This is our second day of the webinar of our college. Our international webinar is on of centers and margins, origins, conflicts, and issues. I would like to welcome you. You have got 8 to 9 minutes for your talk. I will knock you just 2 minutes before of your completion. I humbly request you that you will finish your speech within time, because just after this session, our first plenary session is there. So I request you finish in time, and I will call the name serially as listed there. Let's get started on time. Our first paper presenter is Shoaib Ekram, Assistant Professor of English Department, Rabindra Bharati University. Over to you, Shoaib. Please get started.
Thank you. Am I audible?
Yes, you are audible. Please
Thank you.
continue.
Good morning, everyone. The title of my paper is Identity Through the Trajectory of Gender. A playwright of high stature in contemporary India, famous for critiquing society, stalwart in textualizing and staging alternate sexuality, Mahesh Dattani makes a daring effort, perhaps for the first time in our country, to drag on a public stage what is socially deemed as taboo, but yet enjoyed and becomes a living reality through his plays on a Magi Night in Mumbai. The play was first performed at Tata Theatre, Mumbai on 23rd November 1998 and later adopted by Sanjeev Shah as a screenplay. It deals with the emotions of those who are excluded from the mainstream of our society. The play comprises of complex and conflictual situations. Every act is a potential text. The dramatic technique of Dattani brings out the true potential and nature of the characters present in the play. It challenges the preconceived notion of love and marriage which is prevalent in our society. Dattani takes the notion of love to an almost different level where it transcends the boundary of sex. The play deals with emotions of love betrayal that do exist in all relationships, but the only difference being that the relationship being talked about here does not have the sanction of society. The unflinching and unconditional love that Kamlesh harbors for Ed is no less weak than the intensity seen in an heterosexual relationship. The play is set in one locale, the living room of Kamlesh, a homosexual and a fashion designer in Mumbai. Kamlesh, the hero of the play, convenes a meeting in his flat of his friends Sharad, Bunny, Ranjit, and Dipali, whose help he is needed in order to come out of the problematic situations which he faces. The guests in Kamlesh's living room are all homosexuals like Kamlesh himself. The only heterosexual seen is Kiran, Kamlesh's sister. The physical affair of Kamlesh and Ed comes to light when he strongly supports the marriage between Kiran and Ed. The discussion of proposal throws light on the grey areas of the lives of the homosexuals. The play, as we know, deals with the same sex relationship which our society forbids. And in such a society, it is nearly impossible for such a relationship to bloom. Thus, there are only two choices left before them. Either they hide themselves under the garb of normal people or they flee for the country for the West. Prakash and Bunny takes the former route, whereas Ranjit and his English lover takes recluse in the latter. The former choice is even more difficult to live with because in such a situation the individual dangles between two identities. One to which the identity does not belong and the other from which the individual is running away. Ranjit, who leaves the country for the West, is happier as compared to his friends back home. He leads his life the way he wants without negotiations and compromises. He says, "Call me what you will. My English lover and I have been living together for 12 years now. You lot will never be able to find a lover in this wretched country." Bunny advises Kamlesh to get married to a girl and continue his feeling as a homosexual. Bunny himself is married and well settled. This is his way of having what is denied to him. He advises Kamlesh to follow the norms of society.
Sorry to interrupt you.
Yes, please.
Sorry to interrupt you, but can you please turn on your camera?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you.
Right. Bunny advises Kamlesh to get married to a girl and continue his feeling as an homosexual. Bunny himself is married and well settled. This is his way of having what is denied to him. He advises Kamlesh to follow the norms of society and at the same time have his way to fulfill his own sexual desires. He advises Kamlesh, since you want us to help you, let me give you some advice. You, my friend, are looking in wrong places to forget Prakash. Get married. The constant rejection and marginalization which these characters undergo has a very detrimental effect on their psychology. They start introspecting only to find faults within. There are some characters who are strong, who can combat and withstand the marginalization, whereas others simply break. Sharad challenges the belief that a man should change his sexuality to be accepted in society. The fixed parameters of the accepted norms are made fun of by him. He ironically calls the heterosexual man a king, and he pokes fun at the entire idea, saying he too can become a king by making little changes here and there. Kamlesh, on the other hand, lacks self confidence. Hence, he starts viewing his sexual orientation as improper. He equates it with something which is wrong, something which is evil. He says, I knew I needed medication. I chose the psychiatrist out of the yellow pages. He pretended to understand until he began to tell me about aversion therapy. For a while, I believed him because the medication helped me cope up with my depression better. Until he said I would never be happy as a gay man. It is impossible to change society, he said, but it may be possible for me to reorient myself. The third act begins with a lusty cry of Bharat. The loud noise and pomp and show does not seem to be interesting to the characters present in the living room of Kamlesh. The word of homosexual is dark, hidden due to the fear of society. Ranjit shuts the window to feign the loud sound of the Bharat. The opening and shutting of the window is symbolic. Shutting of the window here represents shutting of the world outside. The world of homosexual is now confined to the four walls of the room. It represents a small space which they carve for themselves, a space which they can claim as their world, a space which they can give the freedom to be who they are, a space which does not force them to wear masks of different identities. So this space naturally is always threatened by the world outside, hence its existence is always in jeopardy. Prakash, who now pretends to be a homosexual, Prakash, who was an homosexual, now pretends to be a heterosexual, wants to demolish this space. He opens the window and he says, look around you, look outside, look at the wedding crowd out there. They are the real men and women out there. You got to see them to know what I mean. But you don't want to. You don't want to look at the world outside this den of yours. All you want is to live in your own little bubble. The dramatist, through his play, aptly puts forth the issues of marriage, both conventional and unconventional. The dramatist shows a failed and a troubled conventional marriage in Kiran, and in Bunny, the dramatist shows us how homosexuals, through a garb of conventional marriage, can continue his love for the same sex. The Tani presents the dilemma of Indian homosexuals who have two different mindsets. The one that realizes the importance of heterosexual man and the power they exercise. They consider them as real man-woman. The other mindset is represented by people who are content with their present identity as pure gay. Prakash represents the former mindset, whereas Sharad represents the latter. The Tani takes a dig at the society which does not give any scope for the homosexual to fulfill their desires. The constant fear of rejection and being marginalized make them look for alternatives. They know that if they fulfill their longings of being homosexual, they would be damaging their reputation and identity. Their sexuality is suppressed and killed by the rules and regulations framed by our society. The Tani challenges the conservative Indian setup with its hypocrisies. His characters are at constant conflict with the society, longing for its approval. This conflict is not always external, but within one's hidden regions of unconsciousness. What is fascinating about the play is the bold and frank treatment of homosexual theme given by the dramatist. Depiction of such theme calls for guts and courage on the part of dramatist. The Tani handles this postmodernistic issue in a very daring manner. He has instilled courage and spirit into the minds of his characters, who can now speak for their love, which is evidenced through Kamlesh's remark when he says, let them talk. If two men want to love one another, what's the harm? Thank you.
Thank you for showing us a new voice in mainstream society. Thank you. Thank you for showing us a new voice in mainstream society. I would like to call our next presenter, Shovan Maity, whose topic is on dynamics of subjugation and the ritual of sacrifice, a study of marginality in Indira Goswami's The Man from Chinnamasta. Please carry on.
Thank you, ma'am. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Panchla College, Department of English and Department of Bengali, and the whole organizing team for giving me such an opportunity to share my views in this international webinar. Before beginning, I would like to pay due respect to the Honorable Chair and my fellow speakers. The title of my paper is Dynamics of Subjugation and the Ritual of Sacrifice, a study of marginality in Indira Goswami's The Man from Chinnamasta. We all know that marginality is the position of people on the periphery, preventing their access to resources, opportunities, freedom of choices, and the development of personal capabilities. It results in confinement, seclusion, displacement, and other clipping disadvantages, and brings forth various layers of social closure. By social closure, it means that it is the process of subordination in which one group usurps all opportunities by bringing another group to its knees. Now, in her masterpiece, The Man from Chinnamasta, Indira Goswami shows her expertise in projecting convincingly the pathetic plight of the marginalized. The novel revolves around the horror, cruelty, and superstitions related to animal sacrifice at Kamakya Temple, Assam. It is a plea on the part of the author to stop the age-old practice of animal sacrifice at the temple. The novel met with a lot of resistance, especially on the part of conservatives, and Goswami had to even face death threats. The novel tells a very powerful tale of a violent struggle between anti-animal sacrifice group and pro-animal sacrifice group, both basing their arguments on ancient holy scriptures, especially the Kalika Purana. The rituals of sacrifice has established a kind of hegemonic hold over the uneducated and half-educated devotees. The tantrics and their rituals show the cunning and hypocritic society muddled in the superstitious beliefs. Religion is such a strong influence and deep rooted in the minds of the common people that they are not ready to violate the rules of it. It is like a mass hypnotism where people unknowingly practice rituals and the fear is always be hovering on them. The self-declared custodians of religion instill that fear to the people to exploit them under the aegis of religion. The stories of Dorothy, Vidhibala, and other women folk of this novel are very much expository to unmask the oppressive nature of the superstitious belief and hypocritical patriarchy. Goswami had tried to portray Dorothy Brown as a strong and confident woman, not willing to suppressed by the authority. But throughout the novel, what we have seen that Dorothy has become an easy prey of endless lewd remarks, glances, insults, and gets sexually assaulted. A childless woman, Dorothy is devastated by her lascivious husband. She takes refuge under Jotadhari, the ascetic from Chinnamasta. Dorothy's entry into the territory of Kamakya has created furore. She has been an object of curiosity for the local, while a section is skeptic about her intention of coming to the temple. Another section directly opposes her stay in this holy place. Even she has been called a whore by her husband. This professor husband, both as a member of the powerful class and a male, tries to dominate and subjugate. As a ploy to prove himself right, he leaves no stone unturned to tarnish the image of Dorothy in front of society. The attempted rape of Dorothy is an expression of power and supremacy of male and a show of their masculinity. Her decision to leave her husband was seen as an act of rebellion, and the rape attempt is the reaction to this rebellion and reaches its extreme with her brutal murder. Now, another character, the injustice done to Vidhibala is other example of gender subjugation. Her father, Singhadatta, was the authoritative voice, and he has taken all the decisions on her behalf. He orders her to marry a 40-year-old man with 2 wives. As a girl, as a woman, she is forced to be submissive and conforms to the norms without raising her voice. She is denied basic education because she is not a boy and forced to take up the roles of a loving wife and nurturing mother. Once she stood up to her father to voice out her concerns, but she didn't even finish the sentence. And the father, furious at his daughter's audacity, lost control and threw his khadu at her. Vidhibala's deplorable state is mirrored in the calf that has been brought for sacrifice for her. Having observed the helpless face of that animal, suddenly she could see the predatory face of the grey-haired man to whom she would soon be married. Vidhivala empathizes with the calf who, like her, is soon to face its fatal fate. With Ratnadhar's help, she sets the buffalo free, much to the displeasure of her father. To get rid of her father's tyrannical clutches, she runs away with a group of prostitutes and finally died. Ratnadhar, shocked by his death, by its death, he laments, Vidhivala, they made a sacrifice you instead of the buffalo. Her death is a statement of protest, but the agencies against whom she protests fail to decipher the meaning of her statement. Vishnupriya, who is Ratnadhar's mother, is another gender subaltern in the novel. She is the representative of the wives of the powerful priests who are never involved in discourse making. She has spent her whole life cooking for the judgments. Despite day-long hard labor, women like her do not complain against or demand anything from their husbands. Now, the male character, who is Jotadhari, with his strong assertive voice against animal sacrifice at Devi's altar, has only earned several enemies. The franchise priests, who are determined to continue the age-old ritual of blood sacrifice, are against him. When the group led by him marches to the chief priest to present their petition to him, their fanatic opponents surround them and challenge them to offer their flesh and blood before stopping animal sacrifice. Jotadhari accepts the challenge and cuts a piece of flesh from his body and offers it to Mother Kamakya. His young disciples also follow him, and this is the symbolic success, and it has told so many things. It manages to raise a doubt, a question against the powerful and deep-rooted hegemony. The novel thus vividly exposed the ruthlessness of religious orthodoxy and male chauvinism that have thrashed the marginalized section of the society and forced them to lead an infernal life. The domination of patriarchy through different machineries is so strong that women, even the stronger ones, resort to silence when they realize that their words cannot bring any change to their conditions. Thank you all.
Professor Shovan Maity from Santal Vidroh Sharoda Shatobarshiki Mahavidyalaya, Goaltor, Paschim Medinapur, has given us a specific sense of marginality by religious orthodoxy and or by social hegemony in different aspects. Okay, thank you. Let's. I would like to call our third paper presenter, Shruti. Shruti, can you introduce yourself and start your paper? Shruti VS, I think the topic is on the issue of gender and violence in Maya Rao's work and Neelam Man Singh Chaudhury's Dark Brothers. Are you there? Shruti VS. Shruti VS, are you there? Okay, so our next paper presenter is Shubhajit Chaudhury, whose paper is on Fall of an Individual and Society in Borderland, Africa. Who was responsible from this fall? The colonized or the colonizers? With Chinua Achebe's Things Fall Apart. Please continue, Shubhajit Chaudhury. I think he's not also there. So I will call the fifth paper presenter, Sinoj Antony, who is from lovely Professional University, whose topic is on. Sinoj, are you there?
Yes, madam. Good morning. Very good morning, madam.
Very good morning. Your topic is on hyperreality and
Yes.
postmodern Indian literature, conflicts
Yes.
between fake and real in post-colonial era. Please continue. Please.
Okay. I think very good morning to one and all. Yes. I think I am audible. Yes. I hope that, madam. I hope that I am audible.
Yes, yes, you are audible.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. So my topic is this. Before that, I am just going to present my paper. So I hope that the presentation is visible to you. Yes. I hope that the presentation is visible.
Yes, yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. Anyhow, first of all, I give my special thanks to the department, concerned department, for conducting such a webinar and also this conference. Yeah, I'm very glad to present my paper in this particular conference. My topic is this: hyperreality and postmodern Indian literature, conflicts between fake and real in post-colonial era. So I am Sinoj Antony. I'm a research scholar from Lovely Professional University, Bhagwada, Punjab, and I reside in Kerala. I am from Kerala. So what is hyperreality? So first of all, let me tell you about the hyperreality is the inability of consciousness to distinguish reality from a simulation of reality, especially in technologically advanced societies. So now at present, we are dealing with the science and technology, and even everything is related with our technology only. Even today, we conduct our classes, we conduct this particular seminar or this conference through technology. So it is closely associated. This hyperreality is closely associated with this technology, and sometimes the fake or then will be appeared as fake. So we have certain this was first introduced by French sociologist and postmodern critic Jean Baudrillard in his work Simulacra and Simulation. He defined it as it is a generation by models of a real without origin or reality. That means a hyperreal. So we know about Jean Baudrillard. Okay, he is a famous French philosopher, and he introduced this particular term, and it is closely associated with his particular work Simulacra and Simulation. And there he explains about the fake realities and identities of this technological world. So, according to him, there are four successive phases of the image. The first phase is called it is the reflection of a profound reality, and second phase it masks and denotates a profound reality, and third phase it masks the absence of a profound reality, and the fourth one it has no relation to any reality whatsoever. It is its own pure simulacrum. So that is what happens with the hyper reality. So firstly it appears as the reflection of a reality, then it masks the reality, then the reality is missing there. So we can say there is the absence of a particular reality, and at the end it forms its own simulacrum. So it forms its own reality. So that is why it is known as hyper reality. So in the first case, the image is a good appearance. Representation is of the sacramental order. In the second, it is an evil appearance. It is of the order of malfeasance. In the third, it is of the order of sorcery. In the fourth, it is no longer of the order of appearances, but of simulation. The last phase is regarded as the hyperreality. According to Baudrillard, today, real is replaced by hyperreal. So if we look everywhere, so wherever the hyperreality appears, we can see that the element of hyperreality can be seen in almost all human areas like media, news, advertisements, film, literature. Particularly, we are people dealing with literature, and especially in fiction, science fiction and all, we can see a lot of elements of hyperreality. Art and architecture, television, economics, digital games, and even in philosophy. So everywhere, the influence of hyperreality is seen as well as it is visible. According to Baudrillard, the signs and symbols of modern world play a vital role to design and define the reality. For example, the excessive use of fake Photoshop replaced the real image to hyperreal image, and hyperreal image influence and attract the people. So today we use social media, and in social media, in every social media platform, we can see the use or the exaggeration of this artificiality, or we can say that it is as a hyper reality. Bernard, as a best example, he says about Disneyland. Disneyland is a perfect model of all the entangled orders of simulacra. It is first of all a play of illusions and phantoms, the brides, the frontier, the future world, etc. This imaginary world is supposed to ensure the success of the operation, but what attracts the crowds the most is, without a doubt, the social microcosm, the religious miniaturized pleasure of real America, of its constraints and joys. That means, so all the miniature forms we will feel that it is real. And even if we analyze in the literature as well as in the film and all, we can see that a lot of characters, fictional characters, are appearing as real characters, and even the children, they admire it, even the characters of a particular novel or a story. Now I'm just going to apply this hyper reality in postmodernism. So before that, let me say something about postmodernism. Postmodernism is a theoretical approach that started after the Second World War, particularly during the Cold War in the late 1960s and early 1960s countries. In the beginning, it was started with architecture and humanities. It accepted and promoted entire culture, belief and practices. It emphasizes to personal culture experiences, language, and practice. It rejected the domination and bullying of science. Now, in Indian literature, how can we find out this influence? Okay, madam. If we analyze the Indian literature, we will be able to know that after 1980s, the postmodern diction revived all the genres more than post-World War effects, post-colonial circumstances influenced Indian literature. Indian English fictions have got wide acceptance and publicity across the world. After the publication of Arundhati Roy's The God of Small Things in 1997, the early Indian postmodern fictional writers such as R.K. Narayan, Raja Rao, Mulraj Anand, Arun Joshi, Anita Desai, and a few other well-known writers got wide reach for their fictional writings. And these figures took the Indian English literature to its heights. In India, post-1980 is described as a postmodern period. After 1980s, India realized itself as a multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, post-colonial and postmodern nation. So let me go to the last section, conflict between fake and real in post-colonial Indian literature. R.K. Narayan's The Guide is a best example for post-colonial elements in Indian literature. He is a post-colonial Indian writer. We can see that his novels were between the traditions and the values on the one side and modern Western values on the other side. Post-colonial literature tries to promote the traditional culture, the Western impact of Indian culture, and life is highly depicted in his novel. Malgudi is a fictional place where most of the stories are taking place, and the readers feel that it is a real place. And in this way, if we analyze in many other novels as well as other fictional writings, we can see the conflict between the real and the fake. Sometimes the readers will feel that the fake is real, and that way it happens. So that about my topic. In the postmodern literature as well as in post-colonial literature, we can find out the hyper-real elements. So anyhow, once again, I give my regards and thanks for giving me this opportunity. Thank you, everyone. Particularly, thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. So I am going to stop my presentation.
Thank you, Sinoj, Antony. Now, I like to introduce our next paper presenter, Smitha G. Lakshmana, whose topic is on concept of identity and sexuality in Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. Please continue.
Hi, ma'am. Good morning. It's a
And
pleasure.
please introduce yourself first. Then
Yeah, definitely, ma'am. I'm Smitha G. Lakshmana, and I'm working as an assistant professor with KLE Society's Degree College, Nagabavi, Bangalore. And I'm a research scholar from Jain University, Bangalore. So my research topic in PhD is very similar to what I'm presenting right now. Like even there, I'm, looking forward to the topic of identity, sexuality in contemporary literature. So when I got to know that center of margins, like we in center of margins that we can present a paper like that, I thought let me alter the topic and present something else. So sorry, ma'am, I don't have any PPT to present, but I can just go on speaking about it. So speaking about it, I'd like to, first speak about Victorian literature in general. Like after that, I would like to give little information about Victorian women. Then I can, conclude with concept of identity and sexuality in Jane Eyre and Wuthering. So, in the Victorian period of literature, it coincides with the years that Queen Victoria ruled Great Britain and its empire. During this era, Britain was transformed with a predominantly rural and agricultural society into an urban and industrial one. And new technologies like railroads and the steam printing press united Britons both physically and intellectually. Although now the period is popularly known as the time of prim, conservative moral values, the Victorians perceive their world as rapidly changing. One more thing we are supposed to understand when we speak about Victorian literature is the religious changes what happened that is pretty important when we consider the concept of identity. So reformers fought for safe workplaces and sanitary reforms and universal education. And especially Victorian literature reflects all these values and all these cultural concerns. And Victorian literature completely differs from that of 18th century and romantic or any other era of literary movement. So just give me a second. And when we speak about, ma'am, can you see me? Like, am I visible?
Yes, you are visible and audible.
Huh.
So
Yeah.
perfectly.
Yeah, yeah. And during the Victorian era, women's life typically revolved around the domestic sphere of a family and the home. And especially middle class women were brought up to be, very pure and innocent and tender and sexually undemanding and submissive and obedient. So these are some of the characteristics what we can attribute to the Victorian women. And the education of women just consisted of learning to sing, dance, and play the piano, to draw, read, write, or any, such small things, not beyond, these particular areas. So with that, just give me a second. One second. With that, I'd like to jump to my, concept of identity and sexuality in Jane Eyre first. Then I'll go to Wuthering Heights. From the beginning, we see Jane struggling for identity, and while she was in her aunt's place, while she went to Lowood, or why when she went to with Mr. Rochester, or from then she went to her cousin's place. In all these places, we saw that one thing, like she struggled for identity, and from her childhood, that sense of belonging and how she craved for longship, it's pretty evident. And one thing we can say, while living in Gateshead Hall initially as a child, she was constantly reminded herself that she's not part of the family, and she can never be given importance the same way as her cousins were given. And this continues not only this does not stop not only in our house, it continues in the school as well, wherein the head of the school, he's not pretty considerate to Jane Eyre, wherein he punishes her and he treats her pretty indifferently compared to the other people. Now, moving on to her, progress in. As she, becomes a governess in Mr. Rochester House, and that's a different power play what we can see with Mr. Rochester and the other social circle. Even she craves for her individual identity there. And one thing we are supposed to acknowledge and appreciate the writer, that throughout the novel we see Jane Eyre fighting for her independence and struggling to have an hold on her identity. Like she never let go herself. I mean, the writer didn't make Jane Eyre let go herself. She wanted to prove through her novel how identity can be maintained and can be fought for, especially her individuality. And we see how brave and adamant Jane Eyre was in. And speaking about sexuality, like I think Charlotte Bronte wanted to, educate n number of readers across the world that Victorian women are pretty different and are struggling women. With that, I'd like to say, just give me a minute. Jane Eyre, does not only stay true to herself, during her quest for identity or independence, and she tries to free herself from patriarchal society, and she tries to overcome, and she tries to, forget or let go the oppression she failed in the she went through in the Reed family, or the starvation in the Lowood school, or during her wandering before reaching Marsh End, or madness in the Red Room, or Thornfield, coldness by being lonely. And we can never forget how Mr. St. John had treated her. Even though, she longs for that identity, she longs for that independence, she longs for love, she does not let any main character like Mr. Rochester or St. John to exploit her and to consider or make use of her feelings. She never gave that particular chance. And what one thing we can observe in this particular novelist, she longed for equality wherever she went. She never settled for less. So with this, I would like to, quickly speak about
Okay, you have 2 minutes more.
yeah, quickly speak about Wuthering Heights. I mean, one thing, I would not take much time, but these two novels, it's very interesting. And there's this dialogue wherein Catherine says to Nellie, wherein she confesses that Heathcliff is more than I am. Whatever our souls are made of, his and mine are the same. I think it's pretty famous dialogue what we come across, and we see Emily Bronte attributing equal characteristics, like equal amount of, masculinity, even in Catherine's character. I think we can come across it. And during the novel, we can see how Catherine displays a desire to, be completely, completely have that freedom, like whatever she does. And one more thing, what we can say is, when Catherine and Heathcliff, have that separation and desire for reunification, it reveals a woman who found herself in the undefined middle ground, being a woman or a man, isn't it? And however, one thing we have to make sure, Wuthering Heights does not necessarily prove that Bronte ever did gender unity. Probably she was just trying to say common things through simple words, but now we can understand that it's a representation of what Bronte wished for, not only like she had already accomplished, like despite her masculine writing, she also considered, conventionally feministic characteristics in her works. With this, I'd like to end my presentation. Yes, thank you, ma'am.
It's on patriarchal and we can say the margin and the thoughts. So we can understand it. Now, uh, sorry, our next is Ayra.
Ma'am, sorry, but your voice is not audible.
Oh, bro, you think? Now you can hear me. Am I audible?
Yes, ma'am, yes, you are audible.
Okay. Okay. Your paper is on a woman is voiceless victim of patriarchal society. So,
Yes, ma'am. Good
please
morning, ma'am.
continue.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Seema Parveen. I am a research scholar of KMC University, Lucknow. I am going to present a paper entitled "A Woman is Voiceless Victim of Patriarchal Society." Traditionally, an Indian woman has four status role as a daughter, wife, housewife, and mother, and they were not allowed to express their opinions or feelings. The psychology of Indian women is broken, dismantled because the quality of submission taught to her from the birth only. She has to submissive, silent, meek, dumbfounded in front of society. She has her own opinion, then she will be treated as an outcast. She has to say yes in every condition, either acceptable or not acceptable. This mental psyche shatters her whole life. She loses her courage to live a dignified life. She sacrifices her soul, but that is not enough. Sometimes death becomes the gateway for freedom from all the worries and pain of patriarchy. She is not supposed to stand up, not to voice out, but a spellbounded being. She is the person whose life is hanging between two families, one is father, other is a husband. She is the receiver of pain and provider for love filling up all the needs for her family. Patriarchy shows that women have social power in every important structure of society and that women don't have any real access to such structure. Patriarchy refer Patriarchy refers to a social system whereby males dominate women. Patriarchy is almost everywhere in traditional societies. Women have always been a goddess of sacrifice and compromise. These things are deeply rooted in her from ages. Patriarchy is a system whereby women are kept subordinate in a number of ways. Women's subordination refers to the inferior position of women, their lack of access to resource and decision making, etc. In the uh, in the patriarchal society, women is the one who has been the victim and she has always been associated with her father and husband uh, with her father and husband name. A woman is always identified with reference to man. The Indian woman has been a silent sufferer of the old traditional system. Being an educated middle class women, they are silent, isolated, frustrated in their families. Therefore, the exploitation, humiliation, and violence make them feel inferior throughout her life. Thus, their social taboos construct and impose the traditional values on them. Patriarchal leads to silence, which in turn leads to fear. In the patriarchal society, a woman is taught to be shy and submissive because of her well-being. In male-dominated mindset of culture has played a major role to subjugate a woman. Marriage is also a major obstacle to emancipate women's individuality in Indian society. Marriage comes with a lot of responsibilities and norms and traditions. Therefore, a woman has to fulfill all the traditions and customs of their families on behalf of their own interest. Parents impose their desires on their daughters, which they have to follow. Marriage is a part of tradition and modernity in which a woman has to get married just because the sake of their parents, relatives, and society. If they are working, their husband don't allow them to work and they have to struggle between tradition and modernity. They have to manage their home and their career. In between, they lost their individuality for what they are seeking in the male dominated society. To conclude, that women should recognize themselves to establish their status in the male dominated society. To describe the female identity is important for a woman to know about herself. A woman should know the feelings, desires, and conscious of a feeling for making their relationship sound. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Seema, uh, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Smruthi, Sivakumar, are you there?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay.
Just a
Please,
minute.
I would like to call you for I would like to request you to present your paper, uh, which is on a woman is sorry, the pursuit of reclaiming roots and the politics of peripheral hygiene, a post-colonial examination of Sally Morgan's face. Okay, please carry on.
Thank you, ma'am. I hope my slide is visible.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
A very good morning to everyone present here. I'm Smruthi, a second year student of MA English, Stella Maris College, Chennai. And the title of my presentation is The Pursuit of Reclaiming Roots and the Politics of Peripheral Origin, a Postcolonial Examination of Sally Morgan's My Place. Before I begin, I'd like to thank the Department of English and Bengali, Panchla Mahavidyalaya, and the respected chair for giving me this valuable opportunity to present amidst eminent scholars and professors. I hope my slide has moved. My Place is an autobiography by Sally Morgan and is a seminal text in the corpus of Australian literature in English, for it encapsulates the Aboriginals' experience under the colonial regime, which was accompanied by the infamous and ruthless policy of ethnic cleansing and also resulting in the stolen generation and the infliction of subsequent trauma. Morgan writes about how, from the very beginning, her family, her mother and Nan keep on insisting that they are Indian and strategically hide the fact from her that they are actually natives of the Australian land. I'd like to quote a few lines from the conversation Morgan has with her mother. The kids at school want to know what country we come from. They reckon we are not Aussies. Come on, Mum, what are we? What do the kids at school say about their origin? Anything, Italian, Greek, Indian, tell them you're Indian. Now, no more questions. So we see how her peripheral origin is veiled with false answers, and this tendency to conceal one's nativity can be attributed to the post-colonial trauma, which has nailed the position of inferiority and the narrative of the wretched and the uncivilized native into the minds of the colonized. The scars of this history of hegemonic oppression is evident as Nan says to Morgan, you don't know what the government's like. You're too young. You don't know what they say behind your back. And then Morgan adds, I was often puzzled by the way Mum and Nan approached anyone in authority. It was as if they were frightened. It is through Jill, her sister, that Morgan becomes conscious of her blackness and how her Aboriginality is heavily stigmatized and looked down upon. As she says, it is a terrible thing to be an Aboriginal. You can be Indian, Dutch, Italian, anything, but not Aboriginal. One episode that Morgan recounts that is evident of the prevalent xenophobic attitudes towards the Aboriginals is when the deacon of the church calls Sally to meet him and persuades her to break off her friendship with Mary. I quote from the novel, I'd like you to stop mixing with Mary. He smiled his charming smile. When she asked why, he goes on to say, you're a bad influence. You must realize that. This is Mary's leaving here. I don't want her mixing with you in case she picks up any of your bad habits. Morgan's journey towards, I hope the slide has changed. Morgan's journey towards the knowledge of her Aboriginal heritage was definitely not a bed of roses, as both Nan and her mother evaded the topic of their origin always and avoided confrontation. And when Sally applies for an Aboriginal scholarship at her university, the authorities make the process as difficult and humiliating as possible for her, as they almost refuse to grant her the scholarship. She says, what would you like me to do? Bring my grandmother and mother in and parade them up and down so you can all have a look? It hadn't been easy trying to identify being Aboriginal. No one was sympathetic, and so many people equated it with dollars and cents. No one understood why it was important. I knew that for some reason it was very important I stay on the scholarship. The Aboriginal scholarship to Morgan meant not just a monetary benefit, but a route to her roots. As she goes on to record her mother's, uncles, and Nan's heart-wrenching stories of subjugation, she exposes the colonial atrocities and institutionalized racism. Morgan's uncle recounts, and I quote, I remember seeing native people all chained up around the neck and hands walking behind a policeman. I used to think what we have done to be treated like that made me want to cry just watching them. Sometimes we'd hear about white men going shooting black fellas for sport, just like we were some kind of an animal. Her Her mother's encounter with a white lady on a bus also is one that shows deep seated stereotypes, which I would like to quote. "You're very beautiful, dear," she said. "What nationality are you? Indian?" "No," I smiled. "I'm Aboriginal." She looked at me in shock. "You can't be," she said. "I am." "Oh, you poor thing," she said, putting her arm around me. "What on earth are you going to do?" She looked at me with such pity. I felt really embarrassed. And when she went home, and when Sally's mother went home and told her mother about this, she asked her never to reveal that she is Aboriginal. She then says, "I suddenly felt like a criminal." Similarly, Nan's story of how the white masters forcefully exploited the native women and introduced a whole generation of mixed race children and the many inhuman treatments meted to them, which Nan could not even talk about, aids Morgan in rewriting history as she undermines the labels and stereotypes and throws light on the unsung sacrifices of the Australian natives. She not only challenges the hegemony in the cultural space, but also in the literary space as she attempts writing an autobiography, which is a departure from the usual Eurocentric approach to writing an autobiography. She transforms her personal autobiography into a communal autobiography, hence making the personal political. I would like to conclude by summing up the important observations made in my paper. Morgan's exercise of writing this autobiography is a conscious attempt at writing against the grain and hence becomes an act of resistance. By centering the marginalized narrative, she acquires agency as the chronicler of history from the perspective of the silenced other and disrupts all hierarchies governing the dichotomy brought in with the colonial regime. Morgan's act of not subscribing to feel humiliated upon discovering her aboriginality and instead feeling honored about reconnecting and reclaiming her roots is at once revolutionary and subversive, disrupting the continuation of the discourse and ideologies planted by colonization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Smruthi Sivakumar. Yes, our next participant is Sneha Chatterjee. Sneha Chatterjee, are you there? Sneha Chatterjee. I think she is not there. Our last name is on the list is Snehapriya. 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 Yes.
Yes, ma'am. I
Yes,
shall
please
share my.
continue. Okay.
I shall share my screen, ma'am, and then I'll continue.
Okay. Please continue and give us an introduction of yours.
Yes, ma'am. So, good morning, everyone. I'm Snehapriya Pius, a research scholar from Christ Deemed to be University. So, first of all, I would like to thank the department and the chair for actually selecting my paper. So, the title of my paper is Unearthing and Documenting Rich Oral Tradition of India Through Translation. India is one among the many countries in the world that has the largest number of tribal communities. As per the Anthropological Survey of India, there are 461 tribal communities. As per 2011 census, this constitutes 8.2% of total population in India. The tribal communities are found along the stretches from Himalayas to the south of India and also from Rajasthan to northeast India. The languages of these communities are oral in nature and are categorized into 6 linguistic groupings. They are Antamese, Austro-Asiatic, Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, Sino-Tibetan, and Kradai. As per the survey done by linguists, there are 1,635 native languages, out of which 197 are classified by UNESCO as endangered and vulnerable. According to Ganesh N. Devi, the founder director of the Bhasha Research and Publication Center, Vadodara, and Adivasi Academy at Tejgad, Gujarat, India may have lost 220 languages since 1961. Another 150 languages might vanish in the next 50 years. Renowned linguist Noam Chomsky says, "A language is the mirror of the mind. It is significant to preserve the tribal languages as it provides indigenous and traditional knowledge of the society and history. Even the ecology, geography, and climatic formation can be unraveled through these timeless gems. It is not just a symbol of culture, but an emblem of human diversity. In these communities, the information is being passed on orally from one generation to the other. So when language declines, the knowledge system declines. Renowned academician Aisha Kidwai says, with the loss of language comes the loss of everything in culture, and loss of solidarity, the loss of man himself. The oral literature encompasses the socio political thought process of these societies. Not just this, the oral tradition provided information regarding age old human civilizations as well as human coexistence. Hence, it is significant to appreciate the role played by tribal languages in enriching the cultural and linguistic diversity at global level. Oral narratives are the foundation by which knowledge is produced, reproduced, preserved, and transmitted from generation to generation. This connects the speaker and the listener in community experience by uniting the past and present in collective memory. Oral traditions might wither away on account of numerous factors such as socio-political economic transitions, cultural shifts, technological innovations, globalization, cosmopolitanism, etc. The oral narratives of the tribal communities were overlooked as it was less visible in comparison to other languages because of its orality, and it was unavailable in the mainstream. The oral traditions of many ethnic groups are not yet documented, but lately efforts are being taken from various quarters to preserve this treasure trove. This involves translation of these indigenous languages. Translation in orality involves transmission of culture across languages. Hence, through translation, not just the meaning being transmitted, but cultural context and practices are also interpreted. Translation is a cognitive process which involves reading, analyzing, and interpreting respectively. This return to orality through translation is a significant postmodern turn in linguistic analysis, as it goes against the older notion that language is stable, fixed, and has ordered movement. Through translation of oral narratives, the earlier idea that language progress in linear and temporal order is subverted and accepts simultaneity through unlimited expansion across space and time. Orality travels across time and space and it is not attached to the string called author. Thus, the translation of orality is an attempt to reunite language with discourse. In orality, collective consciousness, plurality, and dynamism are the most distinctive features. Hence, in translation of oral narratives, it is not just a transformation of oral to written form, but provides space for collective rather than individual. In these translations, the concept of source has an extended meaning beyond the textual concept. Here, it refers to all who produce orality. This refers to narrators, storytellers, performers, and all oral sources. Thus, the duty of the translator is not just to reproduce, but recreate the world of orality. The multiple narratives in oral tradition makes it dynamic as well as distinctive. Thus, involves numerous convergences and divergences, which again points to the aspect that translation of these works are transcreation and not just transformation. Translation is a dialogue, and the translator is an all powerful reader and a free agent as a writer, points out Susan Bassnett and Harish Trivedi in their opinion. Translation is a reciprocal process of exchange between the donor and the recipient cultures. They reject the Eurocentric extremes of restricted interpretation of any text and argue along with Sherry Simon and Homi Bhabha in favor of a new politics of in-betweenness for a reassessment of the creative potentialities of liminal space. Translation showcases a strong form of resistance. R. Parthasarathi says, and I quote, translation is, I believe, an attempt to give voice to the voiceless languages of the world. By translating Indian literature into an international language such as English, I am enabling the writers to be read outside their linguistic frontiers. It is a powerful tool that helps in the empowerment of a weak language. Through translation, it imparts power to the powerless. Conclusion. Language acts as a medium to impart knowledge, that is, history, culture, traditions, laws, ecology, etc., And this knowledge is passed on from one generation to the next. The cultural history and knowledge of a community that might have existed for years will be lost forever with the death of a language. Translation helps in bringing the experiences of indigenous communities alive through an exploration into their world of narratives, which in turn creates a feeling of relevance, appreciation, and a sense of belongingness towards tribal culture. Translation acts as a medium to rediscover, revive, and register these unheard voices which remained outside the fold of mainstream literature. Through translation, hegemonical reign of dominant language is challenged, and it dissolves the border between mainstream and periphery. This results in creating alternate spaces for the survival of oral traditions by acquiring wider readership, circulation, and fellowship of mainstream world literature. In India, various organizations are working towards preserving the rich oral traditions through translation. R. Parthasarathi says, and I quote, translation is the oxygen that keeps a language alive. Without it, the language would become stale and its air unbreathable. Thus, translation might help in creating more readers of that language, if not speakers. It will also help in maintaining diversity and leading the world away from linguistic monopolies. These are my references. And once again, thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you. Thank all of you. Is there any question? I would like to say that. Is there any questions? So we can continue the question answer session. And our paper presenters, I'm calling the name. Are you there? Shruti VS, Shubhajit Choudhury, and Sneha Chatterjee. I think they are absent today. So, have you any questions? Have you any questions regarding this paper of your?
Excuse me, ma'am, not a question, but just an observation. I really liked Sir Antony's presentation on hyperreality and how he related it to the town of Malgudi. So that was a
Can you
really
turn on
interesting
your camera,
presentation.
please?
Thank you, thank
Smruti,
you, thank you, madam. Thank
can
you,
you turn
Smruthi
on your
Sivakumar,
camera?
madam.
Yes, ma'am, just a minute.
Okay.
I have turned it on. Can you see me, ma'am?
Chameli.
Ma'am, I have turned my camera on.
But we cannot see you.
Oh, I'll try again, ma'am.
Okay, fine. You can tell. Okay, fine. It's just a technical issue. You
Ma'am,
can
I
tell.
have turned my camera on again. Can you see me, ma'am?
Okay,
Yes,
okay.
ma'am.
Thank you. I can see you.
Yes, ma'am. That was just an observation and a compliment I wanted to give him. That's it, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay, okay, thank you. I think I am audible to you. Thank you, Smruthi Sivakumar, madam, for your compliment. Okay, thank you very much. And even your presentation
Welcome,
was
sir.
also very nice, very appreciable. Okay, it was a very good presentation.
Thank you, sir.
Okay. Now I can say something that we are called on to honor our implication and involvement in the works we read, rather than serving as shamefaced bystanders to our own aesthetic response. Uh, Here, my argument links up with the recent ethical turn in literary studies, an exertion to look at rather than through the literary work to attend to the act of saying rather than only to substance of what is said. The act of reading enacts an ethics and a politics in its own right, rather than being a displacement of something more essential that is taking place elsewhere. In the context, I find my drawn toward the idea of emphatic experience, a phrase that can do justice to the differential force and intensity of aesthetic encounters without subscribing to essentialist dichotomies uh, of high versus low art. The last few decades have inspired uh, critics of canonicity and traditional value hierarchies. It's all too clearly demonstrate evaluation is not optional. We are condemned to choose, required to rank, endlessly engaged in practices of selecting, sorting, distinguishing, privileging, whether in academia or in everyday life. We need only look at the text. We elect to interrupt. We elect to interpret the works we include in our syllabi, or the theories uh, with or the theories which scores the persistence of evaluation in the very act of assigning a negative judgment. Uh, we can tell that uh, it arises out of a complex interplay between institutional structures, interpretive communities, and the idiosyncrasies and of individual taste. We can say that it is in my own concept, I can tell. So let's end it here. In short, in this presentation session, we can see so many questions are laid down in our society life, which we can see through the very eye of literature, and through your great sense of thought you have delivered by your paper, the hegemony, the patriarchy, the gender, the violence, the hyperreality in post-colonial era, and finding identity and sexuality, the peripheral origin problem, and a very good review on linguistics concepts and translations. It all connects to the title of our webinar, looking through the off-center and margin. I just can say it was my great opportunity and great pleasure of being a part of this session. It was I'm very grateful to you. I thank you. I'm very thankful to you because of your very nice, extremely enlightened paper presentation. It was a very, very great experience. Thank you very
Thank you,
much.
ma'am.
Thank you very much for this paper presentation. So we can end it now. Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much
Thank you, ma'am.
for your patience and all these things.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, ma'am. Thank you.